Hey everyone, Civi here. Welcome to the second episode of Vipertech Talk. If you're watching this after purchasing your first VT, congratulations and welcome to your new rifle. After you have finished admiring your new rifle's exquisite build quality, playing around with the incredibly satisfying trigger, and maybe even inserting a magazine and torching off a few dry fire rounds, you may be wondering, what's next? Naturally, you could just take your rifle to a field, dial in the hop-up, and then start playing with it, but as I will discuss, that is not the best way to experience a Vipertech. As I mentioned in my previous video, VTs are close to being perfect out of the box, but there are a few very simple improvements that anyone can make that can drastically increase their VT's performance. In this episode, I will be talking about 5 simple things you can and should do to new VT rifles in order to drastically improve their out-of-the-box performance. As I mentioned earlier, these will be simple things that you can do, so if you're looking for more advanced tuning tips, please stay tuned for future videos, as I will get to those soon. Now that's out of the way, let's get right into it. Step 1. Cleaning and lubrication. When you first receive your rifle, you may be hesitant to disassemble it, and I understand. It's expensive, and you don't necessarily want to break it all apart just in case if something goes horribly wrong. However, there's actually merit to doing so. Firstly, you will understand how your rifle works better, and secondly, it will allow you to clean off the factory lubrication. The factory lubrication is a mixture of oil and grease, and is not bad by any means, but sometimes they have too much applied, and as such, it attracts dust and grime much faster than necessary. In addition, it may be a good idea to replace the factory lubrication with stuff that will better suit your environment. For example, if you are in a region with more dust and sand, switching over to oil-based lubricants may be a better option for you. My recommendation is to fully disassemble your rifle, clean it thoroughly, then reapply the lubrication of choice to contact points. Good points to apply lubrication in the lower fire control group are the sear engagement on the trigger, the sear engagement on the hammer, the disconnector engagement on the hammer, the disconnector hook, and the trigger and hammer pins. Lubricating the sear and disconnector surfaces will help reduce wear in the long run, while also leading to a smoother trigger pull. Applying lubrication to the trigger and hammer pins also makes for a smoother pull. On the upper parts, apply lubrication to all contact surfaces on your bolt carrier. The rails on the carrier, the underside where it contacts the hammer, the underside of the rear, and the top of the rear are good places to apply lubrication. In addition, the top surfaces of the charging handle also benefit from having some lubrication added. And as always, with any kind of lubrication, less is more. Don't go crazy with lubrication, or you will end up creating gunk that builds up much quicker. If you aren't sure about where to apply lube, a good way to find contact points is to look for bare metal. If the parts have exposed metal, then it's most likely a friction point. Different types of lubrication exist, with many people saying X or Y works best. I will just say to use whatever lubrication you want, but most importantly to make sure that it works for your application. For me and many other VT owners, I find Superlube Synthetic PTFE grease to be a perfect lubricant to use. It is clear, odorless, and requires less reapplication than oils. A thin film on all the surfaces mentioned earlier will do just fine. Alternatively, if the idea of applying grease to your internals, like the fire control group, bothers you, I have tried Hops number 9 gun oil. It works well, but will require you to reapply much more often. For O-rings, I like to use Superlube O-ring grease. This helps to reduce friction ever so slightly, improves air seal, and minimizes damage to the O-ring through abrasion. Once again, a thin layer spread around the O-ring does wonders. Lastly, when your rifle is still new, make sure to clean and reapply lubrication more frequently. This should be done to remove old lubrication that has attracted the debris from the finish on parts wearing in, especially in the fire control group. As the finish wears in, you can go for longer periods of time without cleaning and reapplying lubrication. Step 2. Barrel cleaning. While your VTs may arrive from the factory assembled and ready to play with, oftentimes people forget that between the factory and the rifle arriving at your doorstep, the inner barrel may have collected small amounts of dust and debris. In addition, the factory lubrication may have found its way into the bucking, making your shots much less consistent out of the box, so cleaning it first is highly recommended. To do so, get a barrel cleaning rod, take a bit of paper towel, soak it in some rubbing alcohol or alcohol gel, then gently swab your barrel, rotating the rod as you go. Repeat until the paper comes out without residue, then repeat one more time with a dry paper towel wad. Residue can build up either from the factory or from regular usage, so cleaning your barrel is a must, especially for any GBBR. Step 3. Replace your buffer. Vipertech rifles come from the factory with a very nicely machined aluminum buffer. The weight is not much to write home about, but it is not entirely insignificant, coming in at a mass of 52 grams. In comparison, a carbine buffer is meant to weigh around 3 ounces or 85 grams. However, the change in mass is not the main reason why we swap out the buffers. The main issue with airsoft buffers is that they are typically one solid piece and do not contain shifting weights. While the lightweight nature of the VT buffer means that the rifle can cycle nice and quickly, other aspects of the cycle can be drastically improved without greatly affecting the cyclic rate. The solution is very simple. Replace it with a real buffer with shifting weights. Real buffers provide a plethora of improvements to your cycle: increased efficiency, a more well-balanced cycle that feels smoother without sacrificing speed, and will ensure the carrier returns to battery fully and consistently. The reason why these buffers grant such considerable improvements is due to the shifting weights inside. They allow the bolt carrier to return to battery with less peak force spread out over a longer period of time. Most airsoft specific buffers do not have these shifting weights, and as a result will not give you these improvements. For more detail on the principle of operation of shifting weights, look up how a dead blow hammer works. Naturally, the follow-up question would be, what weight of buffer should I get? If you have tried messing with gas blowback rifles before, then you will know that a heavier buffer will translate into an increase in felt recoil at the detriment of shot count per gram of gas. This naturally applies to VT rifles as well. Given that they already have a precisely balanced gas consumption, a buffer that is too heavy will render the rifle unable to cycle effectively at all temperatures. For example, a buffer that is a bit too heavy may still work in warmer climates, but at colder temperatures, it may be unable to cycle properly or experience significantly worse cooldown. Drawing upon user experience as well as my own, I can comfortably make the following recommendations. If you are running propane, a carbine 3-ounce buffer is sufficient for both 16 and 18mm carriers. If you want to further reduce bolt bounce and increase recoil at the cost of shot count and cooldown resistance, you can run an H1 buffer with both 16 and 18mm carriers without issue. If you are running CO2, either with modified GHK magazines or Vipertech CO2 capsule magazines, it is recommended to run at minimum an H1 buffer and up to an H2 buffer for the greatest amount of felt recoil. For those of you who are familiar with GBBRs, this modification shouldn't be news. It is very easy and very cheap. You can get a decent carbine buffer for less than 20 USD, and it drastically improves the performance of your rifle, whether it is a VT or some other AR pattern rifle. Of course, you can get pricier ones for brand recognition and bragging rights, but for all intents and purposes, the cheapest one with shifting weights will do just fine. However, when buying super cheap buffers, do be careful not to get the kind with a single weight instead of 3 separate ones, as those are less effective at eliminating bolt bounce. And lastly, if you are in a place where obtaining a real buffer is unrealistic and can only acquire airsoft specific buffers, make sure you get one that has multiple shifting weights that are of significant mass. Step 4. Breaking in your rifle. When you first receive your rifle, you may notice that the carrier does not cycle super smoothly within the upper. This is because parts will benefit greatly from having a little bit of time to break in. This is an issue that is not unique to VT rifles, but since the tolerances VT manufactures to are much tighter than other brands, the effects are more apparent. There are 2 solutions to this. 1. Let your rifle break in, or 2. Polish the contact points yourself. If you decide to just allow your rifle to break in, then you really don't have to do much other than occasionally reapplying lubricant. After a few hundred rounds, the repeated cycles will gradually wear in your carrier, polishing the contact points for you. Polishing the contact points manually is not a replacement for the break-in period, but it will help it get started, and you will still see an improvement over an unpolished contact surface. The locations to polish are fairly self-explanatory. Any contact points will benefit from polishing, similar to the locations where you want to apply lubricant. The carrier's guide rails, underside of the carrier where it contacts the hammer, and the underside of the rear are good polishing spots. To polish, start with a low grit. I start with 220 to remove some of the parkerization, and work my way up incrementally to 3000, with the higher grits being wet sanded. After 3000, I use metal polish to bring the surface to a mirror sheen. The exact grits you select are not too important. Just don't make too large of a jump between grits, and you should do just fine. If you plan to strip the entire coating, do keep in mind that the parkerized finish on the carriers is meant to prevent the corrosion of the carbon steel underneath. By removing it, you are effectively stripping the carrier of its anti-corrosive coating. To prevent the buildup of corrosion, make sure that your exposed surfaces are kept greased and lubricated well. Of course, if you do see small spots of oxidization on your carrier, you can just repolish it. If the rust is light, you can start again with 2000 grit, then work your way back up to the metal polish. Regardless, corrosion of contact surfaces is very unlikely. This is more of a warning for anyone who is looking to strip their entire carrier of its finish to mimic the chrome-plated carrier look. I would personally not recommend it, but if it is something that you are dead set on doing, then just don't get it wet and keep it well lubricated at all times. If the chrome-plated look is that important to you, just get a chrome-plated carrier out of the factory. In addition to providing the silver color contrast against your receiver, it also provides a low-friction surface that eliminates the need for manual polishing. However, the chrome-plated carriers still have to be broken in, just like the normal carriers. Step 5. Don't use propellant with added silicone oil. It does hurt me a little when I see people using propellant with silicone oil in their rifles, especially VTs. With the large gas consumption of GBB rifles compared to pistols, using propellant with added silicone oil will flood your internals with oil. This is not great. Too much lubrication will attract unnecessary debris and other undesirable buildup. For lubrication, it is much better to manually lubricate, as I described earlier in this video, rather than essentially flooding your internals with lubricant and hoping that some of it gets in the right places. For me, the ideal propellant to use for VTs is propane. Where I live, it is cheap, easily obtainable, and cycles the rifle ever so slightly better than standard green gas. It also does not contain the dreaded silicone oil that standard green gas does. Propane as a propellant is no great secret for GBBR users. it's a great fuel source that powers almost every rifle just fine. However, propane may not be the best choice for everyone. It may not be available at a reasonable cost in some parts of the world. In addition, commercially available propane does have added compounds to help consumers detect leaks. The downside for us, in turn, is that using propane does have a strong smell for those who are not accustomed to it. For these cases, I recommend looking for an airsoft propellant that does not contain silicone oil. Puff Dino is a brand that does offer a line of green gas propellant, silicone oil free. In addition, they offer the silicone oil free gas in both standard and power up versions. In my testing, Puff Dino's 14 kilogram power up gas is closer in performance to propane and has the added benefit of not having unpleasant odors. However, this is a premium that you pay for. Commercially available green gas will always be significantly more expensive than propane. Alrighty, that should just about do it for the 5 simple things that you should do when you first receive your Vipertech. I believe these modifications and procedures to be fairly self-explanatory, all the while increasing both the performance of your rifle as well as increasing your familiarity of the system. However, as I mentioned before, these are just simple tips. More advanced and specific tuning techniques will be covered in the future. Once again, welcome to your new Vipertech. Enjoy it. Admire its unparalleled build quality, play with the glass-like break on the trigger, and revel in that meaty thud that the carrier sends into your shoulder as it cycles. However, don't neglect its needs. Spend some time on your new VT, and it will most certainly pay off in performance and reliability. Thank you all for tuning in for today's episode of Vipertech Talk, and I'll see you all in the next one.